The spring of 1945 arrived not with hope, but with the acrid smell of smoke drifting across what remained of German cities. For millions across Europe, the war's final days meant liberation, reunion, the beginning of something new. But for a specific group of women scattered across the dying Reich, these days carried a different weight entirely. Their uniforms bore the insignia of the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, the Reichsarbeitsdienst. They were clerks, radio operators, nurses, factory workers. They were cogs in a military machine that had ground itself to dust, and now they stood in surrender lines with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much. Among them was Liesel Hoffmann, 23 years old, formerly a signals operator stationed outside Hamburg. Her hands, once steady on telegraph keys, now trembled from hunger. The city she had known was rubble. The rations that had sustained her unit had dwindled to nothing weeks ago. Black bread made with sawdust. Soup that was little more than hot water with floating bits of turnip. She had not tasted real butter since 1942. When American soldiers arrived to process the surrendered women, Liesel expected brutality. The Reich had been clear in its warnings. Enemy soldiers were animals, savages who would humiliate and degrade. She braced herself for violence that never came. Instead, there were forms to fill out, lines to stand in, and a strangeness she could not name. The soldiers looked at them not with hatred, but with something closer to pity. It unsettled her more than rage would have. Within days, Liesel and 200 other women were loaded onto trains heading west toward ports on the North Sea. They did not know their destination. Rumors swirled through the cattle cars, England, France. Some whispered America, but that seemed impossible. America was an ocean away, untouched, unimaginable. The trains crawled through a landscape of devastation. Liesel pressed her face to the gaps in the wooden slats and watched her nation pass in ruins. Cologne's cathedral stood alone amid flattened blocks. Frankfurt was ash. Every kilometre westward revealed the same story. Bridges blown, factories gutted, fields cratered. The Reich had promised victory until the very end. The view from the train car told a different truth. At the port, they were herded onto a transport ship, a converted freighter that smelled of diesel and salt. The women huddled below deck, packed into holds designed for cargo, not passengers. Liesel sat with her back against a cold steel wall and waited for the crossing to begin. She expected deprivation to continue. She expected nothing. What she did not expect was the meal served on the second day at sea. A sailor descended the ladder, carrying metal trays stacked with food. Real food. Liesel watched as he distributed them, one per woman, and when her turn came she stared at the contents as if they might vanish. Boiled potatoes, carrots glistening with moisture, a piece of meat, small but unmistakably beef, and bread. Soft white bread, not the dense gritty blocks they had chewed for years. She picked up the bread. It yielded under her fingers, pillowy and light. She brought it to her nose and inhaled the yeast, the warmth. When she bit into it, the texture was foreign, almost shocking. It dissolved on her tongue, leaving behind a faint sweetness she had forgotten existed. Around her, other women ate in silence, tears streaking down faces too tired to hide them. One woman whispered, "They feed us like this and we are their prisoners?" Liesel could not answer. She ate slowly, each bite an assault on memory. This was what food used to be. This was what the Reich had taken from them, bite by bite, year by year. And now the enemy, the supposed savages, were giving it back. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. Each day brought meals that defied belief. Coffee, weak but real. Soup, thick with vegetables. Once, incredibly, there was a piece of chocolate distributed after dinner. Liesel held it in her palm, dark and glossy, and thought of her younger brother who had loved sweets. He had died in the snows outside Stalingrad. She ate the chocolate slowly, and it tasted like grief. On the 13th day, she climbed onto the deck and saw the skyline of New York rising from the harbor. Steel and glass towers stretched toward the sky, untouched, gleaming in the morning sun. The Statue of Liberty stood with her torch raised, and Liesel felt a strange ache in her chest. This was the enemy's home, and it was intact. Not a single building scarred by bombs, not a single street reduced to rubble. The contrast was unbearable. They were transported inland by train, and Liesel pressed her face to the window as America rolled past. Towns with houses painted white and yellow, fields green and orderly, cars on roads that were smooth, unbroken, children playing in yards, laundry hanging on lines, normalcy, life. It was obscene in its abundance. The camp sat in the countryside of Pennsylvania, surrounded by farmland and low hills. Barbed wire encircled the compound, but the barracks inside were wooden, weatherproofed, heated. They were processed again, counted, catalogued, photographed. Liesel stood in line with the others, waiting for humiliation, waiting for the degradation they had been promised. Instead, they were led to a large room and told to undress. Liesel's heart hammered. This was it. This was when the cruelty would begin. But then the door opened, and guards carried in stacks of clean clothing. Not uniforms, simple dresses, undergarments, socks, and something else, bars of soap. Liesel took hers with hands that shook. It was rectangular, heavy, white as snow. She brought it close and smelled flowers, faint and clean. Real soap, not the gritty, caustic blocks they had used in Germany, made from God knows what. Real soap that smelled like peace. A guard gestured toward the showers. Liesel walked forward, soap clutched tight, and stepped under the spray. Hot water cascaded over her skin, washing away months of grime, sweat, despair. She rubbed the soap between her palms, and it lathered thick and soft. The scent filled the room, drowning out the smell of fear. Around her, women stood under the streams of water and wept openly. Some laughed, high and sharp, as if the world had gone mad. Liesel let the water run over her face and thought of nothing. For the first time in years, she felt clean. If you're as shocked by this as Liesel was, hit that like button. These untold stories deserve to be remembered. Afterward, dressed in the simple cotton dress, she sat on the edge of a bunk in the barracks. The mattress beneath her was firm, covered in clean white sheets that smelled faintly of detergent. She ran her hand over the fabric, smooth and cool. In Hamburg, she had slept on a cot with a blanket that reeked of mildew. Here, in captivity, she had sheets. That night, Liesel pulled out the small journal she had hidden in her coat lining. She had written in it sporadically throughout the war, brief entries when exhaustion allowed. Now, by the light of a bare bulb, she wrote, "We were told we would be treated like animals. Instead, they gave us soap, real soap. How can this be?" The days settled into a rhythm, foreign in its ordinariness. A bell rang at 6 each morning, and the women rose, dressed, and filed out to the parade ground for roll call. Then came work assignments. Some were sent to the kitchen to peel potatoes and wash dishes. Others went to the laundry, where industrial machines churned through loads of linens. A few, including Liesel, were assigned to light assembly work in a small workshop, sorting and packaging items for the camp's use. The labor was not hard. It was not designed to break them. At noon, the bell rang again, and they walked to the refectory. The first time Liesel entered that building, the smell stopped her in her tracks. Bread baking, meat roasting, coffee brewing. It was an olfactory assault, so rich and overwhelming that she felt dizzy. She joined the line, tray in hand, and moved forward slowly. Behind the counter, American cooks ladled food onto plates with an efficiency that suggested routine, not cruelty. When Liesel reached the front, she stared at what was placed before her. Mashed potatoes, white and fluffy, with a small well in the center. Roasted chicken, skin golden and crisp. Green beans glistening with butter. A soft roll. And in a small dish on the side, a pat of butter, pale yellow, sitting on a square of waxed paper. She carried her tray to a long table and sat. Around her, the other women were equally silent, staring at their plates as if they contained secrets. Liesel picked up her fork and pressed it into the potatoes. Steam rose. She brought a forkful to her mouth and tasted salt, cream, richness. She swallowed and felt the warmth spread through her chest. Then she looked at the butter. Her hand trembled as she picked up the knife. She spread the butter onto the roll, watching it melt into the soft bread, turning it glossy. She lifted the roll to her lips and bit down. The butter coated her tongue, smooth and impossibly rich. It was not margarine, it was not oil. It was real butter, the kind she had not tasted since before the war, when her mother used to bake on Sunday mornings. "Is this real butter?" a woman across from her whispered. No one answered. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and enormous. Liesel ate slowly, chewing each bite as if it might disappear. She thought of her mother in Hamburg, if her mother was even still alive. She thought of the letters she had received months ago, before the mail stopped, letters that spoke of hunger so profound that neighbors were boiling weeds to make soup. And here in captivity, she was eating chicken and real butter. The guilt was crushing. After the meal, the women were allowed to visit the canteen, a small building stocked with goods they could purchase using camp script, a currency earned through their work. Liesel walked the aisles in disbelief. Chocolate bars wrapped in bright paper, cigarettes, pencils and notebooks, lipstick, small luxuries that had vanished from German shelves years ago. She bought a Hershey bar, dark brown and rectangular. She held it in her hand and felt its weight. That night, sitting on her bunk, she unwrapped it carefully and broke off a single square. The chocolate melted on her tongue, sweet and bitter at once. She closed her eyes and remembered being a child, sneaking sweets from her grandmother's cupboard. The memory felt like a wound. She wrote in her journal, "I ate real butter today. I have not written those words in 3 years. My family is starving in the ruins of Hamburg, and I am eating butter in America. I do not know how to live with this." 3 weeks after her arrival, a letter came from home. It had been forwarded through Red Cross channels, weeks delayed. Liesel recognized her mother's handwriting on the envelope, shaky and uneven. She opened it with hands that shook. The letter was brief. Paper was scarce. Her mother wrote of the cold, of the lack of fuel, of the hunger that gnawed at them constantly. "We boil potato peels to make broth," she wrote. "If you have anything, send it. Your father grows weaker every day." Liesel sat on her bunk and stared at the words until they blurred. That evening, she went to the refectory and could not eat. She pushed the food around her plate, untouched, while around her the other women mechanically chewed and swallowed. Someone noticed. A woman named Inge leaned over and said quietly, "Letter from home?" Liesel nodded. "Mine said the same," Inge murmured. "They are eating grass. And here we are." There was nothing more to say. The guilt sat heavy in the room, a weight no one could name. The contrast between Liesel's reality and her family's suffering raises uncomfortable questions about war. Share this story with someone who appreciates history's complexity. Some of the women began to feel shame heavier than chains. They were enemies, prisoners of a nation they had been taught to hate. Yet here they were, fed meals of roasted chicken and real butter, given soap and clean sheets, treated with a dignity that seemed impossible. The Reich had demanded their loyalty, sent them to operate radios and sort documents and staff field hospitals, but gave them hunger and ruins in return. America, the sworn enemy, gave them abundance. This inversion gnawed at their souls, unspoken but ever present. Liesel wrote in her journal one night, "Hatred would be easier, hatred I could carry, but this kindness, this incomprehensible kindness, I do not know what to do with." The American guards were not what Liesel had expected. They were young, many of them barely older than the women they supervised. They stood at their posts with rifles slung over shoulders, but their expressions were not cruel. Some looked bored, others looked uncomfortable, as if they too felt the strangeness of the situation. One afternoon, a sergeant walked through the barracks during inspection. He paused near Liesel's bunk and glanced at the small photograph she had pinned to the wall, a picture of her family taken before the war. Her mother, father and brother, all smiling in a garden that no longer existed. "Your family?" he asked in halting German. Liesel nodded. "They safe?" She did not know how to answer. "I hope so," she said finally. He nodded slowly, then moved on. The interaction lasted seconds, but it lodged in her mind. He had asked as if he cared, as if she were not just an enemy, but a person with a family worth asking about. Later, she overheard 2 guards talking near the fence. One was reading a letter from home. "My sister writes that they keep asking me what the prisoners are like," he said. "She thinks they're monsters, but they're not. They're just girls. Tired girls." The other guard grunted. "Yeah, makes you think." Liesel turned away, her chest tight. The battle was no longer between nations. It was internal now, a war between memory and reality, between what she had been told and what she was living. The propaganda had promised degradation, but it had not prepared her for dignity. Dignity was unbearable. She captured it in her journal with painful clarity. To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts. It is harder than hatred. Hatred is easy. Dignity is unbearable. The weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of camp life became familiar. Liesel worked in the assembly shop each morning, sorting bolts and screws into bins, a task so mundane it felt like a fever dream. In the afternoons, she attended English lessons offered by a volunteer teacher, an older woman from the nearby town, who spoke slowly and corrected their pronunciation with patience. In the evenings, she sat on her bunk and wrote letters home that she was not sure would ever arrive. But the most profound changes happened in the small, quiet moments. One day, while carrying a crate across the yard, Liesel stumbled and dropped it. Bolts scattered across the ground. A guard standing nearby moved toward her, and she flinched, bracing for a reprimand. Instead, he knelt and began picking up the bolts, handing them back to her one by one. "Careful," he said in English, then smiled briefly before walking away. For a moment, two enemies had shared a small kindness across a gulf the war had declared unbridgeable. Another evening, a woman named Greta stood near the fence and began singing softly, an old folk song from Bavaria. One by one, other women joined in, their voices blending in the twilight. A guard on patrol stopped and listened. When the song ended, he clapped slowly just once before continuing his rounds. No one spoke of it, but the moment lingered. Then came the work assignments outside the camp. Liesel and a group of 30 women were loaded into trucks and driven to a nearby farm to help with the harvest. The truck rattled down country roads, past fields heavy with corn, past orchards bursting with apples. Liesel stared out the back, watching America unfold in all its impossible abundance. The towns they passed were intact, their main streets lined with shops whose windows displayed goods in quantities that seemed obscene, bakeries with rows of bread, butcher shops with cuts of meat hanging in the windows, pharmacies with shelves stocked floor to ceiling. When they reached the farm, the owner, an older man with sun-weathered skin, greeted them with a nod. He set them to work picking apples, showing them how to twist the fruit gently to avoid bruising. The work was hard but satisfying, and by midday, Liesel's arms ached in a way that felt honest. At lunch, the farmer's wife brought out sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. Liesel unwrapped hers and found thick slices of ham, cheese, lettuce, and mustard on soft white bread. She bit into it and tasted salt, tang, richness. The bread yielded under her teeth, and the ham was tender. She ate sitting under an apple tree, and for a moment it felt as though the war had never happened. But then she thought of her mother, and the sandwich turned to ash in her mouth. On the drive back, the truck passed through a small town. Children played in a park, their laughter drifting through the open air. A movie theater marquee advertised a new film. A diner's neon sign glowed red in the fading light. Liesel watched it all with a growing sense of unreality. America was not only intact, it was thriving. It was a world the war had barely touched, and the contrast with Europe's devastation was too vast to comprehend. That night, in the barracks, the women spoke in low voices. "My city is rubble," one woman said. "My family is living in a basement, and here they have parks, movies, bread in every shop." "Perhaps," another woman ventured carefully, "perhaps we were not told the truth." The silence that followed was heavy. To admit that was to admit everything. It was to question not just the war, but the beliefs that had sustained them through it. It was to confront the possibility that their own nation had lied, had led them into ruin, while insisting on greatness. Liesel lay in her bunk that night and stared at the ceiling. She thought of the butter, the soap, the apple orchard, the sandwiches. She thought of the guards who smiled, the farmer's wife who served them without hesitation, the sergeant who asked about her family. She thought of Hamburg in ruins and New York gleaming under the sun. The inversion was complete. The enemy had shown more humanity than her own leaders ever had. She opened her journal and wrote, "I have eaten more in captivity than in all the years of the Reich's promises. I have slept without fear of bombs, and yet my heart is not at peace. What kind of world is it where the enemy shows more dignity than our own? Autumn arrived, though time inside the wire felt strangely fluid, its passage marked less by calendars than by the rhythm of meals, work, and letters from home that came sporadically, each one a fresh wound. The leaves on the trees beyond the fence turned gold and red, and the air grew crisp. Liesel watched the seasons change and felt time moving in ways she could not name. Beneath the routine, something profound had taken root. For months, she and the others had lived with the shock of survival in America, their days filled with butter, soap, abundance. But now came the harder reckoning, what all of this meant for who they had been and who they might become. Liesel sat on her bunk one evening, journal balanced on her knees. The barracks were quiet, most of the women already asleep or lost in their own thoughts. She wrote, "I have eaten more in captivity than in all the years under the Reich. I have slept without fear of bombs, and yet my heart is not at peace. What kind of world is it where the enemy shows more dignity than our own?" She paused, pen hovering over the page, then continued, "I think of my mother boiling weeds, and I am ashamed. But I think also of the lies we were told, and I am angry. Which is the greater sin? To accept kindness from the enemy, or to have been betrayed by our own?" Around her, other women were adapting in ways Liesel found difficult to watch. Some laughed during meals now, as if the war had never existed. They gossiped, told jokes, sang songs in the evenings. Inge had even started wearing lipstick purchased from the canteen, a bright red that looked garish against her pale skin. Liesel could not join them. The weight of what she had lived, what her family was still living, pressed too heavily. The guards, too, had changed. They no longer saw the women as faceless enemies. They saw individuals. Franz, a young private from Ohio, had begun greeting Liesel by name when he passed her in the yard. Another guard, Sergeant Miller, occasionally brought English-language newspapers to the barracks and left them on a table for the women to practice reading. Once, he stopped near Liesel while she was peeling potatoes in the kitchen and said, "You'd forget for a minute they were the enemy, if you didn't look at the uniforms." The comment unsettled her. She was the enemy. She had served the Reich, believed its propaganda, contributed to its war machine. But here, in this camp, she was being treated as if those things mattered less than her humanity. It was a generosity she did not know how to repay. The work assignments continued, and Liesel found herself sent to different farms, factories, even once to a park where they raked leaves and cleared debris. Each outing exposed her further to the reality of America. Jazz music drifted from car radios, baseball scores were announced on loudspeakers, families picnicked in parks, life flowed around them, uninterrupted, indifferent to the devastation across the ocean. One afternoon, while working at a canning factory, a local woman brought the prisoners coffee during their break. She poured it into tin cups and handed them out with a smile. "Y'all work hard," she said in accented English. "Figured you could use this." Liesel held the cup and inhaled the aroma, rich and dark. She sipped it and tasted sugar, real sugar, dissolved into the bitterness. The woman did not know they were prisoners, or perhaps she did and did not care. Liesel could not decide which possibility unsettled her more. That evening, back in the barracks, a rumor began to circulate. Whispers passed from bunk to bunk. They would be repatriated soon. Transport ships were being arranged. Within months, perhaps weeks, they would return to Germany. The news hit Liesel like a physical blow. Return. To what? To the ruins of Hamburg. To a family she had not seen in over a year. To a nation defeated and starving. She thought of the butter, the soap, the clean sheets. She thought of the abundance she had lived in, even as a prisoner, and she felt something she had not expected. Fear. Around her, other women expressed the same dread in hushed tones. "I am afraid to go back," Inge admitted one night, her voice barely audible. "So am I," another woman said. It was a confession too dangerous to speak aloud during the war, but here in the privacy of the barracks, the truth spilled out. They feared returning not because they loved America, but because they had tasted what life could be, and the contrast with what awaited them was unbearable. Liesel looked at herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her face had filled out. Her cheeks had color. Her hair, once dull and brittle, now shone. She looked younger, healthier, more alive than she had in years. The transformation was visible, undeniable. The enemy had made her well. Her own nation had made her starve. How would her mother react when she saw her? Would there be relief? Or would there be accusation in her eyes, a silent question? You lived well while we suffered. One evening, a woman named Hilda stood in the center of the barracks and voiced what they had all been thinking. What if we do not want to go back? The silence was absolute. We cannot stay, another woman said. We are prisoners, we have no choice. No. But what if we did? Hilda pressed. What if we could choose? Would you return to the ruins or would you stay here? No one answered. The question was too large, too dangerous. To even consider it felt like betrayal, though betrayal of what, Liesel could no longer say. The Reich had fallen. The Führer was dead. Germany was occupied, divided, defeated. What did loyalty mean now? Liesel's transformation reveals something profound about humanity in wartime. Subscribe to discover more untold stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about World War II. Liesel sat on her bunk that night and stared at her journal. She thought of the butter she had tasted, the soap she had used, the sheets she had slept in. She thought of the guards who smiled, the farmers who fed them, the volunteers who taught them English. She thought of America, intact and thriving, and Germany, devastated and starving. And she thought of herself, caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. She wrote, I fear leaving more than I feared arriving. The confession chills me, but it is honest, for the enemy's greatest weapon has not been guns or bombs. It has been butter, soap, dignity, and those things have done what hatred could not. They have changed me. The morning came cold and sharp, frost glazing the windows of the barracks. Liesel woke before the bell, her breath misting in the air. She dressed slowly, pulling on the cotton dress she had been given months ago, now worn soft from washing. Outside the sky was pale, the sun not yet risen. At breakfast no one spoke. The women ate mechanically, forks scraping against metal trays. The butter sat on the table, golden and untouched. Liesel stared at it and felt nothing. After the meal, they were assembled in the yard. A camp administrator stood on a raised platform, a clipboard in his hand. He began reading names. Each name was a summons, a sentence. Each woman whose name was called stepped forward, face blank, and joined the growing line. Liesel stood with her hands clenched at her sides, heart hammering. She listened to the roll call, each syllable landing like a thunderclap. The list went on, and then, Hoffmann, Liesel. She stepped forward into the cold morning light, joining the line of women who would board trucks, then trains, then ships, who would cross the Atlantic once more and return to a Europe they barely recognized. She looked back at the barracks, at the refectory, at the fence that had held her captive and kept her safe. She thought of the butter, the soap, the dignity she had been given by those she was told to hate. And as she stood there, waiting for orders, she realized the true conflict was no longer between nations. It was inside her, in the space where hatred had once lived, and where something new, fragile, dangerous, undeniable had begun to grow. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, you'll want to check out the video on your screen right now. It's another powerful account you won't find in textbooks. And hey, don't forget to subscribe so you catch the next one when it drops. See you in the next story.